Okay. Okay. Um, with Purim coming, and let me just see something. With the advent of Purim, I want to focus on Parshas Zachor. Much of what I'm going to say today, I've said in the past, and some of it I said recently, and because of the war that is taking place in Israel. But on the basis of questions that I've been asked from people, it seems to me that there is a need to repeat for people to understand the halachic perspective of a war of self-defense. And this coming week will be Parshas Zachor, and Parshas Zachor tells us about the mitzvah of never forgetting what Amalek did. And the word Zachor, even though we talk about Parshas Zachor being once a year, but nevertheless, the word Zachor, which is pointed out by many, my uncle also points it out, that Zachor means constant remembrance. There is a need to constantly remember. Sometimes we want to believe that because of the passage of time, the situation has changed. And what in our minds seems to be a change of situation also very rapidly changes. My uncle mentioned that when he was a student at the University of Berlin, so one of his professors, I think was Heidegger, he focused his lectures on the significance and the importance of ethics. And my uncle said that when he was a student, he didn't encounter anti-Semitism in Berlin, in the university. And he felt that he was treated with respect. And shortly afterwards, when the Nazi came into power, so all of Germany adopted the Nazi ideology. There might have been individuals, but the masses, look at the parades, look at the films, look at the esteem that they held Hitler Yamach Shemo. And when one looks at the pictures of the parades in Gaza that took place immediately after the October 7th barbarity by the official soldiers of Hamas, although now we know that they were accompanied not only with the Palestinians in Gaza, who are not official soldiers of Hamas, but even with people associated with the UN. in committing these terrible acts of murder, rape, and destruction against the Jewish people. It's reminiscent of those who stood trial for the atrocities of World War II, who said they were only taking orders. I don't believe that the Palestinians that attended these rallies, these parades, where naked bodies of Jewish women who are still only half alive were being spit on by them. That they were doing it only because they had orders. There might have been some. But the masses came out because they approved. They were enablers. When I talk to some left-wingers, they say they were forced to come out. They were forced to spit. They were forced to cheer. It's easy to give excuses, just as it was easy for the Nazis to give excuses. We were only taking orders. Just as it was easy for the Germans who cheered Hitler Yamach Shemo. Unfortunately, there are people who are stupid enough or choose to be stupid to accept those excuses. And there are some Jews, unfortunately, who have trouble understanding this concept. I think most of them are from the younger generation. They didn't see the generation of the survivors. They saw individuals. But when I was a boy, I would say that almost the majority of the shuls, majority of the people in the shul were survivors. I would mention how by Yisker, sometimes they would have to carry people out, people who lost their first families. And we are now approaching a generation that the pre-war generation of Europe is no longer there. And we're losing to a large degree firsthand victims of World War II. And because of that, people are finding it easier to talk into themselves all kinds of excuses for the events that are happening today. But Zachor, constant remember means be on guard. They come out of nowhere, overnight, as my uncle said. It first comes with tolerating. And after we tolerate, we become followers. And that is what is taking place today. People tell me that people that were their closest friends now refuse to have anything to do with them, all because they're Jewish. And unless we remember, constantly remember, we have to learn from history. I mentioned Zachor Yemo Sola Mubinu Shnos Tov Ador Sha'al Avicha V'Yagedcha Skeinecha V'Yomrulach. We have to learn the lesson of history, the trends of history. History, in other ways, repeats itself. And usually the other ways make it more severe, make it more difficult. And the mitzvah of Zichron Amalek, of remembering Amalek, the Ramban and the Chinuch seems to say, I know people could read it differently, but when I read the Ramban and the Torah in Parshas Kiseitze, and the Chinuch in also on Parshas Kiseitze, in the mitzvah of Skiras Amalek, of remembering what Amalek did to the Jewish people. So it appears that the mitzvah of Skiras Amalek manifests itself in two ways. First of all, a mitzvah of reading it from the Torah. Reading the Parsha from the Torah. Zachor asher asolacha Amalek. And perhaps the reason why we have to read it from the Torah, because this is a mulchama la Hashem ba'amalek midor. It is a war for God, and we are God's soldiers. Midor, from generation to generation. So when we are fighting because God commands us to. And to emphasize that point, after all, Amalek attacks the Jewish people because of the identity that the Jewish people have with God. And do not think that some of the nations of the world who today claim to believe in God don't attack the Jewish people for the very same reason. On the contrary, they have the foundation of their faith in the rejection of the Jewish people. And the rebuilding of the Jewish people, the rebuilding of the Jewish state, is a dagger in their religion. I'm not saying this is true about everybody, but there are many among them that have that attitude. They would want the Jewish people, or many of the Jews, to join their religion in the continuation of the Jewish people. In the heritage of their ancestors, is a negation of their fundamental beliefs. So theirs is a war against God also. It's because they don't want to believe that God has a special relationship with the Jewish people. And they want to prove that God doesn't have a special relationship with the Jewish people. And they want to believe that all the trouble that the Jewish people are encountering is all a perpetuation of the Churban, of the rejection of the Jewish people. And to them, the establishment of the state of Israel, and especially the victory of the 6-Day War, when Yerushalayim was recaptured, presents a dilemma about the foundation of their own religion. Now, and I'm not suggesting, and I'm not accusing all non-Jews of having this attitude. But there are many that do have that attitude. Years ago, I talked with a rabbi who was connected with the Reform movement, happened to be a very fine person, Rabbi Fred Schwartz. And he told me that previously, before coming to Chicago, he was a rabbi, I think, in St. Paul. And at that time, the Catholic Church, or some of the Catholic Church, were trying to create bonds in their mind with the Jewish people. And they wanted to create all kinds of dialogues. At that time, my uncle and Moshe Feinstein came out very strongly against participation in these type of dialogues. And the bishop in St. Paul, I think it was the bishop, I don't remember, had contacted Rabbi Schwartz about the possibility of having dialogues, about the close relationship that it can exist between their religions. And then the 6-Day War broke out, when Nasser openly talked, Nasser Yamach Shemo, openly talked about chasing the Jewish people into the sea, about eradicating Jewish life from what is the state of Israel. And at that time, and again, I'm not saying that every non-Jew or every Catholic had the same attitude. At that time, Rabbi Schwartz contacted the bishop, and he asked that bishop, who was so interested in having unity with him, joining him in dialogue, in peaceful talks, join me now. in coming out with a statement against what Nasser is suggested. And the response, if I recall correctly, that Rabbi Schwartz got was that he can only stay neutral. Stay neutral from what? Neutral from murder? Neutral from destruction? But it's a word. It's an excuse. It's tolerating murder. At that time, I remember, I think I read about it. Rabbi Schwartz wrote a letter, I think, to the Jewish Post of an Opinion. It was 1967. I think he wrote a letter to Post an Opinion. But then when I met him in Chicago, he told me over the story. And I remembered that I had read the letter at that time. I was a boy in high school. So Zachor, sometimes those who are not, sometimes those who are enemies of the Jewish people, they could extend a hand of friendship, but almost overnight. And they can give you great respect, as my uncle said. But almost overnight, it could change. Again, I'm not saying this about every non-Jew. I'm not saying this about every Catholic. But I'm just saying, Zachor, remember, we have to be on constant guard to remember. And not only that, even when the conflict begins, sometimes people give you the appearance that they recognize your hardship. They recognize the danger you're facing. And they're standing with you. But that's only on day one. On day two, they support the murderers. As I mentioned, the Medrash tells us that Paro, on the first day of the enslavement of the Jews, he asked them to volunteer, to help out. To show their loyalty to Egypt. And of course, the Jews in Egypt at that time were loyal citizens. Yosef saved the people of Egypt from starvation, Joseph. And the first day, when the volunteer laborers and the Jews, with the exception of Shevet Levi, all volunteered, all the tribes volunteered to help Egypt in its projects, loyal citizens, ignoring what Levi warned them, what the former generations told them, be careful. And Paro himself went to stand with the Jewish people on the first day. But the second day, they were enslaved. We get impressed with the first day. We should be impressed with who stands with us through the last day, through the duration of the whole period. Those who stand with us only on the first day are trying to make us feel that being loyal citizens demands of us to follow their lead. And when they change, we have to change also. And unfortunately, there are Jews who consider themselves loyal Jews, but in truth are only loyal politicians. And they too will stand with the Jewish people only on the first day. They will come to the demonstrations and give speeches. But then they will talk against those that are fighting in self-defense of the Jewish people. This is what we're facing today. We can't be fooled. Anyway, so the Ramban and the Chinuch, they say that the mitzvah of Zachor and Yetzias Mitzrayim has a double element in it. On one hand, it's a mitzvah of reading from the Torah. But then there's another mitzvah in Zachor and Yetzias Mitzrayim, and that is telling over to your children and your children's children what happened. They compare it to Zikaron, the remembering of Amalek is comparable to the mitzvah of remembering the Exodus from Egypt. We tell our children and I tell our children's children and tell your students and tell everybody you encounter about it. So it's a double mitzvah, reading from the Torah and telling over. And the question is, I think this is why the Chinuch says that's a double element. He says, so the question is, why is it that way? But I think because in Parshas B'Shalach, Moshe Rabbeinu is told, Sozo Zikaron b'Sefer, write it in the Sefer Torah, V'sim ba'azne Yoshua, and put it into the ears of Yoshua. Yoshua is the student of Moshe. He represents the next and future generations. It's not enough to put it in the Torah. It's not enough to read it from the Torah, but you have to put it into the ears of future generations as well. And that's, I think, the reason why the Chinuch said there's a double element in the mitzvah. And I just would add one comment to that. These Rishonim, they compare Zachor and Amalek, remembering Amalek, to Schiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, to remembering the Exodus from Egypt. But it's also compared to Zachor and Shabbos. The mitzvah of Kiddush. The mitzvah of Kiddush, of course, if we have people by the table, so they fulfill the mitzvah because it's considered like they said it. But it's not just to inform others. By Shabbos, when I'm sitting by the table alone, and I say Kiddush, it's not just to perpetuate it for future generations, but I am perpetuating for myself. Because what we don't say, we tend to forget. I think my uncle once in Ala Tshuva, he discusses the necessity for vidui peh. Why is it that the confessional prayer has to be said with the mouth? Why isn't it enough that it's in the heart? But if we say it only, if it's only in the heart, later on, it's much easier to ignore. We have to remind ourselves about what Amalek did. Now, the Brisker Rab, in explaining, he says something that really needs explanation. In explaining why the Torah says on one hand, Sov Zosikarim b'Sefer, write this as a remembrance in the book, the Simbas Yoshua, and put it into the ears of Joshua. He says, because the Torah here is telling us that on one hand, Joshua, who's the successor of Moshe Rabbeinu, he will be, in addition to the transmitting of the written Torah, he is the source of the transmission from Moshe to him of the Torah Shebaal Peh, of the oral tradition. So Yoshua, write it in the Torah Shebechsav, write it in the written Torah. But that's not enough for Simbas and Yoshua. Put in the ears of Yoshua. That represents the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral tradition that was given over. Now the Torah Shebaal Peh applies to the whole Torah, not to just the Parshas Amalek. So why is it emphasized here? The oral tradition. Why is the oral tradition emphasized here in regard to Amalek? But Torah tells us in Parshas B'Shalach, Milchama LaHashem ba'Amalek midor dor. There's a war for God against Amalek in every generation. What's the idea? In every generation. And it doesn't say b'chol dor, in every generation, but from generation to generation. Because there is you should know, anti-Semitism is something that is given over from generation to generation. Amalek gives it over from generation to generation. If there is anti-Semitism today, if people are going and murdering young children who were part of a group that didn't attack them, they weren't part of a society that attacked them. That's because in one form or another, that was given over to them from previous generations. There is a Masorah. Just like we have a Masorah of Dusha, a heritage of holiness, there is a heritage of anti-Semitism that Amalek gives over. And the heritage of anti-Semitism that Amalek gives over from generation to generation is not limited to genetic Amalek. It's in every generation. And that makes it especially incumbent upon us not just to fight Amalek of this generation, but to realize that we too have to receive the Masorah, we have to receive the heritage, we have to receive we have to link ourselves to former generations, to learn from them. And in regard to Amalek, for my generation, I was born shortly after World War II, that is somewhat easier than for the children of this generation. For those who are finding fault with the Jewish people, Jews, because they don't see the survivors. They don't see the first-hand stories. They think that's in the history books. It's all part of the past. But the events, the influence of Amalek on future generations has to become something that we give over. That's part of our Torah Shabbal Peh. When things happen in the past that repeat themselves, when the Torah warns us about things, we have to draw analogies. And it's interesting. One of the most shameful events is when we look at those who are protesting against the Jewish people, against Israel, and they're joined by people who dress up in Hasidic garb. And I know that the Hasidim, as a rule, are not part of that group. They have nothing to do with them. The Satmar Rebbe came out strongly against them. But they were marching. What's interesting, with their young children, they were marching. Instead of giving over the Masorah of how the Jewish people have been attacked time and time again, they are giving over Masorah of Sinas Yisrael, of hatred for the Jewish people. They have adopted not the Masorah of Yaakov and of Moshe and Yoshua, but they have adopted this Masorah of Esav and Amalek. When they march with their children, together with the Sonei Yisrael, our Masorah has to contain the idea of this, the impact that Amalek had on future generations. We have to Zachor. We have to be on constant guard. We can't be asleep. We can't be v'ata ayef v'yageya. We can't be tired, because when we are tired, when we are not on guard, then Amalek attacks. Now, I think there is a third possible shot as to why. Well, there are a number of shots, and there's a shot from the Gra also, but I just want to mention, why is it Ksov Zosi Karim B'Sefer, write it in the book, write it in the Torah as a remembrance what Amalek did, V'Simba Asna Yeshua, and put it in the ears of Yeshua to be transmitted orally. Why is it that way? But I think that the mitzvah of Zikaron Amalek is not just the mitzvah of remembering what ancient Amalek did, who attacked the Jewish people. But the impact that Amalek had on many of the nations of the world throughout the generations, we cannot find. If you read the Parsha of Amalek, as it's written in the Torah, there won't be a reference to the Holocaust. Torah was given long before the Holocaust. There won't be a reference to the Jews that were killed during the Crusades. There won't be a reference to the Jews that were killed by Chomensky. There won't be a reference to the Jews that were killed during the Churban. By Sheni, in Tanakh, you'll have about Churban Bayis Rishon. But all that is probably part of Schiras Amalek also. Remembering what Amalek did. Because whether Hitler Yamach Shemo was genetic Amalek or not, but ideological Amalek he was. It was something that was given over from generation to generation. So we need Simba Ozne Yoshua put in the ears of Yoshua. Ozne Yoshua, that is the Masorah that's given over from generation, the oral tradition that's given over from generation to generation. And the events of Amalek repeat itself from generation to generation. And all that is part of Schiras Amalek. But we have to identify it with Amalek. It's not enough to just say it happened then. It was a continuation. It was a heritage. Again, I'm not chas v'shalom saying that this is true about all non-Jews. I'm not saying it, but we have to be on constant guard because there were many periods when Jews were not on guard. And when they were not on guard, then Amalek attacks. Now, I want to discuss the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek. Now, as a boy, I was very troubled by this mitzvah. To go wipe out the nation of Amalek. To me, it seemed, I didn't know how to understand that mitzvah. And then I noticed in a certain article many years later, my cousin, Rabbi Lichtenstein Zatzal, he talked about how he also confronted that issue. He said, I think, if I remember correctly, he had trouble sleeping at night. And then he said, Reb Chaim was such a Baal Chesed. There was no person, certainly in Reb Chaim's time, that had that concern for every person. And if Reb Chaim wasn't troubled about it, he didn't see a reason why he should be troubled about it. I asked my father about it also. My father gave me an answer that at the time that he gave it to me, I didn't fully comprehend. I did comprehend it on one hand, and on the other hand, I didn't comprehend it. My father told me that my father believed, on the basis of the Rambam and the Hagdamah to Perish HaMishnah, that if a Navi comes, that in order to be required to wage war against Amalek, to eliminate the nation of Amalek, you have to receive a command from a Navi. You have to receive a command from a prophet. He also mentioned that some explain, Milchama Lashem Ba'amalek Midor Dor. It's a war for God. That means only when we receive a message from God is there a mitzvah of waging a war against the nation of Amalek. My father said to me, if a Navi comes and tells you, if a prophet comes and tells, you have to do what the prophet says. There's no questions asked. That's certainly true. But we try to understand mitzvos also. There is the why of the mitzvah, as my uncle would say. And the why of the mitzvah, we were told, that's all. But the what of the mitzvah, we can try to understand. And I wanted to understand the what of the mitzvah Mechiyas Amalek. Now it's interesting, even though the Rambam doesn't say explicitly, except for the Hagdam, the Parashah Mishnah, that a Navi, and he gives the case of Shmuel telling Shaul to wage war against Amalek. But if you take a look at the Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Reb Chaim Heller Sefer HaMitzvahs, and those that had the other girsos, the other texts of the Sefer HaMitzvahs, in the regular Sefer HaMitzvahs, it's not there, but in some texts of the Sefer Mitzvos, and it seems that that seems to have been the proper girsa, that by Milchemes Mitzvah, by a war of mitzvah, you have to have permission of the Urim B'Tumim. You have to have the consent for the Urim B'Tumim. You need the consent to the Urim B'Tumim. Now, it's obvious that if you have the Navi, you don't need the Urim B'Tumim. The purpose of the Urim B'Tumim, the purpose of the Navi, of the prophet, is to let us know that that's the will of heaven. So if one lets us know, if the Navi tells us, then you wouldn't need the Urim B'Tumim. If you have the Urim B'Tumim, you don't need the Navi to tell you. But the question is, what's the idea? Why do we need, at least in regard to Amalek, the Urim B'Tumim? Now, my father, in discussing the Haftorah of this Shabbos, Pakadati, God tells Shmuel, I remember what Amalek did to the Jewish people. Now, have Shaul wage war against Amalek. What's the difference between remember, the word Pakadati, remember, and Schira, remember? Schira means to remember. Pakadati, my father says, is the something in the present reminds me about the past. And when the HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Shmuel Hanavi to wage war against Amalek, Es Harishayim Es Amalek, the wicked Amalek. In other words, the mitzvah of waging war against Amalek is only when Amalek reaches a certain level of wickedness. And that's why we need the Navi. That's why we need the permission from heaven to wage war. Because we are not always in a position to determine the wickedness of Amalek. Now the question is, what is the wickedness of Amalek? Well, Amalek was certainly idolatrous. They were certainly not moral. But I want to suggest that specifically when it comes to Amalek, there has to be a need to wage war against them now. I think the war against Amalek, and I will explain it soon. The war against Amalek is a war of self-defense. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends a Navi, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us through the Urim V'Tumim, now is the time to wage war against Amalek. He is telling us, if you don't wage war against Amalek now, Amalek will wage war against you. And Amalek is going to attempt to destroy you. Pakadati. As Harishayim Amalek. God says he was the Bochei Levavos, and he sees what the ideology of Amalek is right now. And if you don't attack Amalek now, these people will eventually become soldiers, and they are going to destroy you. Perhaps not in every generation is it that way. But there are generations when it is that way. And that's the generations where God informs the Jewish people, now is the time to attack. Now, but that's as far as genetic Amalek is concerned. But there is another Milchemes Mitzvah, and that doesn't apply. We don't know which nation is Amalek today, genetically. After all, Basan Chorov Abibel is Kol Olam Kulo. There are a lot of nations that have the ideology of Amalek, but they're certainly not genetic Amalek, or we certainly have no indication that they are genetic Amalek. But the Rambam says there's another Milchemes Mitzvah. There's another war of mitzvah besides Milchemes Amalek, and that's the war of the Jewish people against the nation that attacks them. Milchemes Yisrael miyad sor sheba alehem. The war of the Jewish people against the enemy that attacks them. And who is the enemy that attacks the Jew? So the question is, where is that mitzvah contained in the Torah? I know it's logical. If someone comes to attack me, I am entitled to defend myself, in spite of what people say. So, Milchemes Yisrael miyad sor sheba alehem. But what's the source? My father said the source is because in the Torah, in Parshas Pinchas, and I've mentioned this recently, Soros and Midyanim harassed the Midianites, Hitzorim heim lachem, because they're harassing you, where our sages says, we see from here, Haba laharcha hashkem lahargo. If they come to attack you, you get up and attack them first. It's a war of self-defense. Even though if somebody takes a gun and tries to shoot me, we have other places in the Torah where it tells us that you can shoot them first. You can defend yourself. But here it's contained that if a nation attacks you, then that nation is a pursuer, that nation. So to defend yourself, you are allowed to pursue that nation. And if the nation takes a gun and holds one of their own in front of you and say, I'm going to shoot you, but you can't shoot me because I am holding one of my nation, you can shoot them, because that's the halacha of war, of self-defense at a national level. And especially where the people of that nation are enablers. And I think the same, my own, so that's the Soros and Midyama harassed the Midianites. It doesn't mean that you could blanketly kill people, but what it means is that you could kill people from that nation if that's necessary for your self-defense. And self-defense means they shouldn't be able to do this attack again. How many times has the United States stopped Israel? But they were told very nicely, you can't put out now a half a fire. We have to learn from our past history. It's not enough to rid them from the ability of attacking us tomorrow. We have to rid them of the ability of attacking us the day after tomorrow as well. Otherwise, it's not self-defense, not complete self-defense. Those who talk about proportionality, oh, yeah, if they go in and kill 2,000 people, so you go in, you count 2,000 people, that's all you can do. What are we doing? We're giving them the ability to attack us again. The idea of proportionality has its foundation in revenge. You eye for an eye in the literal sense, which Chazal tell us is not our halacha, not our law. Those who talk about proportionality, they have no concept of self-defense. They only know vengeance. When we go in, we're going in self-defense, and self-defense means to take away the ability for them to do it again. My uncle said that the mitzvah, a nation that attacks the Jewish people, they have the ideology of Amalek. And he says that's not Machul Timcha Zeich Amalek. That's not eradicate the memory of Amalek. Machul Timcha Zeich Amalek, that's eradicating the memory of Amalek, of genetic Amalek. We don't know of any nation today that is genetic Amalek. But there is nations that have the ideology of Amalek. Nations that attack the Jewish people, that talk about wiping out the Jewish people altogether. But that's a war of self-defense of the present. The war against genetic Amalek, that's a war that we need the Navi to come to tell us to do. But this is a Mechemes Mitzvah. How can we go to war according to the Rambam? We don't have the Urim V'Tumim. We need the Urim V'Tumim when we go out to war. A war of self-defense. We didn't go out to war. They came in to fight us. The Urim V'Tumim is necessary when you go out to war. Then you need the permission of heaven. But when they come to attack us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the permission. Milchama la'Hashem ba'amalek midor dor. It's a war of self-defense. And even though some use the term vengeance, it's not vengeance in the manner that they call vengeance. It's vengeance of letting people know Jewish blood can't be spilled without a price to pay. It's self-defense. The war of the Jewish people is a war of self-defense. And I think that's what Ramalek meant. that Amalek wants to the war against Amalek is a war of self-defense. National Amalek that's dependent upon the Navi coming and telling us if you don't attack them now, they'll attack you. But where they already attacked us, where any nation with the ideology of Amalek attacked us, we don't have to wait. We don't need permission. The permission is given. It's a war in every generation. And we have to, self-defense doesn't mean self-defense for today. It means self-defense for tomorrow and the day after that as well. And when they hold up their own and they hide behind their own, many of who were their enablers, and say, you can't shoot me, but I can shoot you, because I don't care who I'm going to kill from you, then we have to say, we are fighting a war of self-defense. And whatever you're going to do, we're going to come in and protect ourselves and protect our children and protect our future generations as well. Okay. Okay. I don't know. I guess I'm not getting any questions.
Yosher Koach.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you. All right. I don't see. Next week is Purim. So the next year will be 2 weeks from now.
Freilich Purim.
Huh?
Freilich Purim.
Freilich Purim. Okay.
Freilich Purim.
Yeah.
Freilich Purim or Moshe.
Freilich Purim. Okay. How do I?
Just press where it says leave. The red bottom right-hand corner. It says
I don't
leave.
know. Okay. No, it says record. Okay. Whatever. Okay. Yeah, I think you'll have.
I don't know either.
Yeah. Okay.
Cold silver, good to rock.
Yeah. Okay.
You just shut your phone, Reb Moshe.
Okay, I'm going to do that. Trying to. Okay. Okay.
You don't see a red. Oh, okay.